To everybody who has joined us this evening for this ECF webinar. You've shunned the unseasonably warm weather and shunned your newfound freedom to mix as groups of 6 outdoors. So thank you for doing so for this particular webinar. Tonight we're going to cover the future of placemaking, planning and investment in Surrey and Kent, with a particular focus on Tunbridge Wells and Guildford. And it's a pleasure to be joined by 3 esteemed speakers who I'm going to introduce in the order that they'll be speaking tonight. First, we have Rebekah Jubb, a friend of ECF, who's a partner at Bell Cornwell, a planning consultancy covering the whole of the UK, with many projects in and around the home counties. And Rebekah's going to give us a bit of national planning policy and a bit of a picture around that to provide the context for the discussion this evening. Second, we have Cllr Jan Harwood, who's the Deputy Leader of Guildford Borough Council and the Lead Councillor for Climate Change. And we were just commenting before this that it's an interesting time in Guildford with lots of significant schemes coming forward at the moment. So we can probably have quite an interesting discussion on that. And last but not least, we've got Cllr Alan McDermott, who is the leader of Tunbridge Wells Borough Council, and he's also the portfolio holder for planning and transportation. And for the eagle-eyed among you, you probably saw that last Friday the council published its Reg 19 local plan for consultation. So that is very much hot off the press. So the format for proceedings this evening will be as follows. I'm going to ask each panelist a series of questions to set the scene before moving into an interactive Q&A session with the audience. You can submit questions in writing or by using the raise hand function. I think this initial section is going to take about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll allow about 20 to 30 minutes for questions. So we should be finished by about 7:20 this evening, which means you can make the most of what's left of today's sunlight. And it's worth saying that we are recording this session and it's going to be uploaded to YouTube afterwards, subject to the permission of our speakers. So first, I'm going to turn to you, Rebekah. If I could get you to unmute yourself. There you go. You found that. How are you doing this evening? Are you good?
I'm fine, thank you very much.
Excellent. So I think the first question is probably a question that's burning on the lips of most of our audience. How's the planning white paper progressing?
Well, I hate to say it, but it arrived with much fanfare August last year. Headlines left, right and centre. Everybody suddenly knew something about planning and thought that they could see the future. And we were promised that it was being sort of brought forward, being fast-tracked because of recognition of the need to do something with the planning system. There was even talk about we would start to see the fruits of that in the autumn. And we're now well on our way into spring, and there's been very little since then, not surprisingly. And all of the sort of commentary over the last few months about it has been, you know, there's lots of meat in there, there's lots of potential change, there's quite fundamental shifts in the planning system. That's not something you can deliver overnight. Even if everybody bought into the concept of what it's trying to deliver, that takes time. You've got a huge system that's ingrained with a certain way of doing things, and you haven't got the resources or the expertise to deliver on that. Just to give you a little bit of a feel of some of the things it talked about, for those that don't know, there were 3 main pillars that were identified in it. It talked about planning for development, planning for beautiful and sustainable places, and planning for infrastructure. And that all sounds very positive. It's all about trying to drive development, trying to drive things to happen. The planning for development pillar was about zoning, a change in the approach to housing numbers, a change in the approach to how local plans are prepared, and also talking about gentle densification, of trying to make better use of existingly previously developed land. The planning for beautiful and sustainable places element was all about design codes, and also the need to invest in expertise and get those design codes prepared and implemented to make better developments deliverable. And then the planning for infrastructure bit was about, for local authorities, it was really the sort of carrot of if you deliver development, you will get income through these single infrastructure levy and funding for your planning department and infrastructure. And then the stick of, if you don't do it, there'll be penalties, or failing to deliver decisions and housing numbers. So that was really what it was all about. And it's had a mixed reception. There's some stuff in there that makes sense and other things that will just send the system into a spin if you really try to do it. And there's also that question that was raised of, is the planning system actually really broken, or is there something else that's causing the problems? Is it about lack of funding for the departments, lack of resources, lack of well-qualified, sensible planning professionals coming through the education system to feed into the profession? It's something that we see certainly in recruiting. There's a lot of variability in the quality of planning professionals. And there's also the sort of related funding and infrastructure issues to do with delivering development that is nothing to do with planning and the decision-making process. So there's a lot of things to think about. It's not just a case of the white paper's there, let's get on and do it.
I'd like you to name some of the non-sensible planning offered. No.
How long have you got?
And then shocking that you know, government policy has been delayed in terms of its implementation. It's as if, you know, Whitehall doesn't crank into gear immediately when a white paper gets published. So I think you've touched on the current white paper proposals, and I think a question that's really interesting is how do you think it, if we implemented the planning white paper proposals as they are, how would it impact on places like Guildford and Tunbridge Wells? Now, they are two very distinct places, of course, with their own unique dynamics. But, you know, do you see that, you know, the implementation of this will impact on both of our councillors who are here this evening?
I think there's two main things to look at. One is, you know, the headline grabbing housing numbers, housing delivery issue. So both authorities are currently falling into the sort of slight under delivery in terms of housing numbers. They're far from being the worst. But they are both slightly under delivering. Tunbridge Wells is at 85% and Guildford is at 90%. Guildford's actually come up slightly in the last year, whereas Tunbridge Wells is down very slightly. 1%, I'll let them off. It's about the same. And then you've got the local plan situation and the sort of, you know, those housing delivery numbers are looking backwards. If we look forwards, what does it look like? And for Guildford, they have now adopted their local plan after a lot of grief and hassle and High Court challenges, etc. But we do now have an adopted plan from 2019. The difficulty is that it's almost immediately at risk of being out of date because of the housing situation in respect to the housing policies. And the looking forward, the standard methodology, if the government were to introduce this imposed methodology of how you calculate your forecasting housing numbers, Guildford do need to up their game quite significantly compared to the current numbers. Then for Tunbridge Wells, you've just mentioned about the new local plan that's going through, because the old local plan position is a sort of combination of lots of different bits dating back to 2006, some of it, and the most recent adopted policy is 2016. So there's quite a lot of variation in there, but obviously the new local plan, well advanced, you know, getting on with it, potential to sort a lot of that out. But their housing numbers in the standard methodology need to see quite a significant jump in order to meet what the government thinks is required. So in that respect, there's quite a lot of pressure potentially to come on those authorities. In terms of impact wider in the planning system, it's going to have to be about investing in training, new skills, better resourcing the planning department in order to deliver that. Because, you know, for example, with the design codes idea, if that genuinely comes in, every authority is going to need design expertise in-house or be spending a lot of money on consultants to deliver that. And it's one of those subjective things, who's to say what's right and what's wrong, how do you get a design code that everybody can buy into and use, and it actually delivers better development as a result. So there's lots of challenges there as well.
Interesting. That's the sort of thing we can pick up a bit later on with a bit of audience participation as well. And just lastly, how do you think it's going to impact on your own work as a planning consultant?
Well, I would say in my career, I have always known this idea that every change that the government makes is intended to streamline and simplify the system. It's all about trying to make it more accessible, more deliverable, and achieve something better than what's gone before. And if you really believed that, you would start to get worried as a planning consultant to think, oh, nobody's going to need us anymore because it's going to be so simple and straightforward. Everybody will be able to do their own planning. And so far that's never happened, and I don't see any sign of that happening in the future. But likewise with local authorities needing to invest in their professional staff and training, etc., the same will apply to us. In order to look after our clients, give our clients the best service, the best advice, we need to make sure that we're up to speed, that we understand what changes are happening and how we can best use those to make sure that we're doing the best thing for our clients.
You're not going to run out of fees just yet.
No.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll get you just to mute yourself, and then I'm going to bring in Councillor Harwood.
Hello.
Good evening. How are you doing from sunny Guildford?
I am well. You probably don't want to know what I'm wearing below this height, but yeah, I'm well.
I'll leave that to the audience's imagination, I think. So you've obviously just heard what Rebekah's had to say, but
Yep.
I'm going to kick you off in terms of future growth in Guildford. How are you guys preparing for what lies ahead?
There's a lot of elements to that. Picking up on a little bit from the sort of where Rebekah left off, the white paper is hot on our minds. We've been talking about it endlessly for months. Our feeling was that it felt closer to a green paper than necessarily a white paper in many ways. But I think green papers fell out of fashion a little bit before I was born, which is not that long ago, all things considered. So we weren't really sure. I get asked on a regular basis, what do I think of it? What's my impression on it? And I honestly don't have one because I don't really know what it means yet. It doesn't feel concrete enough for me to be able to formulate a solid opinion, though there are some things that give us concern. So what we're doing right now is barreling ahead with our local plan part 2, the DMP, development management policies. We've just sort of gone through the internal process of finalising our Reg 18, post-Reg 18 phase, and we're about to go to our Regulation 19 consultation, hoping to do that in the summer. And we're quite proud of what we were aiming for there. There's some boundaries we're pushing from a biodiversity perspective and renewable and sustainability perspective. So we're gonna see what the horizon holds in terms of how far we can push some of those key priority areas for us. And we're hoping that the inspector will be on board with our aspirations on that. And then we hope to adopt that as soon as possible. So that'll set the scene and prep us for that growth from a quality perspective. But there's also a lot of other tangential bits and pieces that we're doing. So some of you may be aware that Guildford has undergone a fairly comprehensive internal change to a Future Guildford programme. We've streamlined a lot of our internal services, but including our planning and development management and policy teams and everything else. The whole structure, the whole management team has been looked at and restructured. And our IT has been vastly improved. And I think that will tie in massively with handling the volume of applications and the developments we get. It's actually an essential part of it. Over the last year, we've seen a massive uptick, up to a 30% increase in the number of applications we're processing in some months, which is extraordinary. I guess people have a lot of time, and that conservatory that I've always been thinking about seems like the perfect time and perhaps a need for. There's that element, and then finally, I think that I'm certainly undertaking quite a lot of effort to give the impression or to invite businesses back to Guildford. I think it would be dishonest to pretend anything other than that we have lost some ground on that over the last 10, 15 years. To places like Woking and Reading, who've been incredibly ambitious and incredibly focused on their offering, on their business offering, on their commercial offering. And I think places like Guildford, who have relied on a slightly more historic town setting and a more of a cultural hub aspect have fallen behind, and we're very keen to recapture that. So these are some of the areas that we're really focusing in on moving forward.
Great. And then more specifically, having heard what Rebekah said about the government's algorithms and whatever's coming out of Dominic Cummings's mind, or did come out of his mind, and is going to apply to yourself. How are you equipped to meet, the demands for housing in the local area?
Well, we've heard from Rebekah, who's probably keeping track of my numbers almost as closely as I am. I haven't quite got them up on a whiteboard, but it's getting to that point. I get a weekly update on my delivery number because it's such an important aspect. We are desperate to stay above that threshold. We don't want to fall back on a presumption in favour of development, which for a place like Guildford, which is 90% greenbelt, would be absolutely devastating. We just lose that finesse in our level of control over that. How are we doing that? Well, it's slightly tricky, as we know. It looks backwards. So you are shackled at the feet with a very large bit of weight based on historic performance. And as we all know, I mean, I can provide some numbers. I think over the last 10 years, we built 2,750, give or take a couple of change, homes in 10 years. So you got that on one hand, but then on the other hand, you'll often hear in Guildford council settings, people say things like, we're planning to build too many homes. So there is a bit of a discord, and that's a political consideration that we are eternally battling. But from a sort of proactive measurement, we're working really closely with our major sites. There's some of the larger housing delivery options, and doing everything we can to ensure that they feel comfortable coming forward with schemes that work for us, but also, get over the line of sustainability and deliverability, which is a key aspect. So, we've got things like North Street, which are finally going to happen after many years of talking about it. So I think that it feels like we're always skirting close to the line, but nonetheless, there's a huge drive for us to make a lot of this happen so that we avoid some of the really negative outcomes, all with the white paper looming over the top of us at the same time, of course.
And sort of linked to that, and this will be my last question to you at this stage. Just, we've seen lots and lots of different schemes and applications coming forward in Guildford now. If you look forward in the next 2 to 3 years, where do you think the real investment opportunities are? If there's somebody looking to invest in your borough at the moment, where are they? Well,
I think a key area for us is going to be our high-tech industry in Guildford. Guildford has a slightly under the radar at times set of specialties in the gaming sector, the digital health sector, and the space industry. And I think with our science park and our university and a major hospital all working together, I think that's going to be a key area of investment. Whether we through a sort of innovative little hubs for SMEs and new startups, or even down a slightly more FinTech-esque offering, digitally based. We also have some digital infrastructure coming in fairly soon with a fibre optic broadband being laid across Surrey. So all these elements, I think, will really make a right ground for investment in that sector, in enabling that technological boom. But also, I think that'll come with it the support roles, and our council currently is quite focused on social housing and social rented housing. So I think key worker housing is going to be something that we'll certainly be driving forward for. So I would say those are the two key areas where I expect to be massive growth over the next 10, 15 years.
Brilliant. Okay, I would just get you to mute yourself, and I'll bring in Cllr McDermott. And I'll just say to everybody, if you do have questions, feel free to raise your hand or submit in writing via a Q&A. Cllr McDermott, do we have you from Tunbridge Wells? Good evening. So the first question to you, how are you guys? I mean, it's timely because obviously you've just published your local plan documentation. So you probably preempted a lot of these questions, but nonetheless, how are you preparing for future growth?
Yeah, well, having a local plan in place, of course, is a key part of this preparation. Tunbridge Wells Borough is incredibly constrained. It's already been mentioned, there's 70% A&OB, 22% greenbelt, areas of flooding, areas where the infrastructure is under pressure. At the same time, the positives associated with growth, both economically and in terms of residences, are understood, particularly as the borough and certain parts of the borough are amongst the least affordable in Kent. The constraints make accommodating growth difficult and requires the council to make some very difficult decisions, including the proposed de-designation of greenbelt and some major development in the A&OB. In terms of how the growth will be delivered, there is a substantial 14 hectares of employment land proposed and now permitted at the eastern side of the Royal Tunbridge Wells, close to the recently upgraded A21 junction, Highbridge railway station, existing employment areas. Through a new area plan for Royal Tunbridge Wells Town Centre to be developed to the town centre can adapt to the changes in retail office, commuting, correct to the changes in retail, office, commuting that have been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Some housing growth at Royal Tunbridge Wells and Southborough and the smaller settlements. 2 strategic sites are coming up: the transformation expansion of Paddock Wood, including into land in the adjoining parish of 3,600 houses, a rejuvenated town centre, and a substantial expansion of the employment land in the north of the settlement, and a standalone settlement at Chudley Village of 2,800 houses, based on a walkable and cycle-able layout. With the services and facilities to deal with day-to-day needs, including secondary and primary schools, there will be a bus and cycling routes to nearby towns, Tonbridge and Paddock Wood, and the rail services there. Thank you.
Oh, you caught me unaware there. You caught me unaware. I suppose linked to that, and I think you've sort of covered it, particularly Paddock Wood and Chudley Village as well. Is really how's the borough equipped to meet its current and forecast housing demands?
Well, we are hoping to build all the houses we have to. The government's methodology indicates that we have to build 677 houses a year, which is more than double the existing 300 in the core strategy of 2010. This equates to 12,200 houses over the planned period until 2038. However, as before, this requires difficult decisions about where development should go.
And then in terms of investment opportunities for those who are on the call, if you were advising people who are looking at Tunbridge Wells as an area to invest in, where do you think those opportunities are?
In the short term, within the established employment area of Royal Tunbridge Wells, Southborough and Paddock Wood, also within the town centres including Royal Tunbridge Wells, whilst having been impacted by some of the recent national changes in retail, remains a hugely attractive environment. We will find out how many shops reopen, of course, in a couple of days. I doubt whether all of them will continue to be working. In the medium to long term in these areas, plus the new employment area sites at Tunbridge Wells, Paddock Wood, and a smaller employment location at Hawkhurst, in the eastern side of the borough, Paddock Wood particularly represents a great location with access to a rail station and the A228 with its linkages to the A21 and M20.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience now. So questions into the written Q&A and hands up, please, if possible. And if there aren't any hands flying up and aren't any questions coming in, I'm going to take the liberty of just asking as many questions as I so wish. So if you don't want to hear from me, then get your questions in. I want to focus actually in on an area that both of our councillors mentioned, and Rebekah, I'll bring you in as well. And it's around the future of town centres. Obviously, with the impact of the pandemic looming and changes potentially in commuter habits and the such like, how do you see the future of town centres panning out? Both of your areas have significant town centre locations. What are you doing to drive growth in those particular areas? Councillor Harwood, I'll bring you in first.
Sure. I mean, you've teed it up for me nicely, actually, because we have a major town centre regeneration project that's just started underway, encompassing quite a large area, in fact, the entirety of the town centre all along the riverfront, looking at master planning the entirety of it and looking at it from a very much a 21st century perspective, with an emphasis and an acceptance of the changing commercial and the high street frontage circumstances. Whether even before the COVID, I think there was the signs were on the wall, so to speak.
Yeah.
In that regard. So it's a program of projects and consultants we've already engaged with to sort of tackle it head on. And going forward, it'll be a key priority for the council. I mean, we essentially have a portfolio holder dedicated to that role, and it's part of our corporate priorities.
And from a placemaking perspective, what's the steer that you're giving as a council in terms of what you want to see delivered in the town centre moving forward? You know, it's an old historic town centre. I should confess I was at university up in Guildford for 4 years, so I know it really well. Beautiful high street, but you know, in need of a bit of love. What does it need from a placemaking perspective to bring it up to its former glory?
You've kind of touched on it a little bit. I won't speak on behalf of every single councillor, but certainly from my perspective and some of my colleagues' perspective, what we really want to see is a honest and intellectually honest approach to the harmonic nature of an old historic setting with a need for future growth and technology and the new demand that we're seeing from our societal shift as we shift to a slightly more digital world, if not already fully digital in many ways. Yeah. And that kind of that's a pretty delicate balance. We don't want to forget the historic elements of the town, but I think we have to accept that certain things have to change. So for us, it's going to be about finding out those elements of the town that need to be preserved as they are, the elements that need to be regenerated, and elements where we feel a lot freer to perhaps push the limits on what can be achieved from a design perspective, from a placemaking perspective, and really rethink the whole traffic issue around the town as well, and other elements that all feed into it, and open up Guildford in a way that is much more forward thinking as opposed to being a car reliant town. I think that's a major aspect of our aspirations.
Well, I can give you 3 controversial words if you like: low traffic neighbourhood. Rather than draw you on that question, I'm going to throw over to Councillor McDermott. In terms of the town centres in your borough, what does the future hold?
Well, we're very similar to before the master planning. You've got to have master planning for the whole of the developments going on. We've got 3 main centres though, which is a problem. We've got the Pantiles down the bottom, which is what most people recognise as Tunbridge Wells. So there's the Pantiles. Then you come up the high street and you go up past the station up to the top, which is where British Land own Royal Victoria Place, which is our equivalent of Blue Water, although about a quarter the size, if that. So we have 2 developments there, and then we go further on to St John's Road and Southborough, and there's more shopping arcades up there. So we have 3 centres in Tunbridge Wells rather than the one.
Yeah.
And really, they all have their own different problems. The Pantiles, of course, is very well known because of the situation. It started in 1560s. Also 1650s, I'll get that wrong, 1650s, and it's therefore been there quite some time. There's a nice little village around the area, and it's a very nice area for people to come and visit during the evenings in the summer, if we're allowed to again. They have jazz and the Pantiles and things like this. Whereas at the top, where British Land own Royal Victoria Place, there it's nearly all just shopping, and the banks and everything else are up there. So there's 2 complete different sections, areas there. Whereas further up towards where the old hospital used to be, there are a lot more shops up there as well. So it's a large development, and we are working very hard on a master plan to get everything working together.
And how are you anticipating the pandemic having an impact? Are you thinking that the retail is going to come out the back end as well, or what's the council forecasting?
Well, I would think I'd do about 10 hours a day on Zoom, and I should think about 6 hours of that is pandemic.
Yeah.
Every day, there's damn it. There's hopefully, fingers crossed, that we are actually going to come out of it now. I think that Boris Johnson does not want to go back into a lockdown again, and I think it may take longer to get out of it to start with, but I think it will be the end of it. I think, hopefully. Keeping my fingers crossed. And I look forward to seeing some shops open, and pubs, of course.
Well, we're going to hold you to account in 6 months' time. If we're back in lockdown, I'm going to.
I'll buy you a drink there.
Yeah, come and buy me a pint. Absolutely, Rebekah. I'm going to bring you in on the subject in terms of you can probably provide a wider picture in terms of what you've seen going on in terms of town centre regeneration and the such like. What's been the good? What's been the bad? What does the future hold?
I think that changes in town centres and high streets was already an issue before the pandemic, and I think it has just accelerated something that was going to happen at some point. What I've been encouraged by from a planning perspective is actually the government has almost been proactive about it and has genuinely actually fast-tracked some changes in terms of the use classes order, introducing this new Class E that covers a range of community, leisure, retail and employment uses all into one, with the intention that that would increase flexibility and allow for property owners to change the use without needing to apply for planning permission within a group of uses that are all recognised as having their place in town centres. And I think that that recognition of what town centres comprise is changing, and I expect that we will see a lot more opportunities for a range of things, you know, restaurants, cafes, co-working spaces, a lot of flexible uses, leisure, community, all of those things, everything that people do, you know, all in one place, rather than you go there for shopping and you go somewhere else to work and, you know, you have certain things at home. I think there'll be more residential in town centres as well, and an attempt to try and really create a sort of vibrant atmosphere with a completely different mix to what we were used to in the past. And I think we have to do that, otherwise it's just not going to survive in any meaningful sense.
Well, just when I thought Monday night couldn't get any more glamorous, we started talking about use class orders. So there we go. Excellent. Well, that's been an interesting discussion on town centres. So I'm just looking now at the questions. There's a couple have come in unsurprisingly, specifically for Councillor McDermott, given that the local plan has just been published. The first question in today is, how do you think the decision of the inspectors to find that Tonbridge and Malling local plan unsound due to failing the duty to cooperate will impact the progress of the local plan, given your borough also does not propose to take any of Sevenoaks' unmet need?
That's quite a good question. In the case of Tunbridge and Malling and Sevenoaks, we are always talking to them. We have said to all the surrounding boroughs, including in Sussex, because we're right on the boundary of Sussex, that we will do all our own houses, but we have no room to do anyone else's. So we are building every house that we are supposed to build. We are building in the borough of Tunbridge Wells. Some may be close to the borders with someone else, but then that's the way of the world. But unfortunately, fortunately, we have got quite good arrangements and also good conversations with our neighbouring boroughs in all descriptions. So that's going fairly well. I would think the inspector won't be at all happy, as Sevenoaks you mentioned as well, of course, was another situation, as well as Tunbridge and Malling, and also Weald, which is another borough close to us. They all had the same sort of problems. They didn't get agreements with the surrounding boroughs, which we intend to do.
I mean, the second question is linked to that actually, and you know, given what's happened locally, you know, are you confident that the draft local plan will not suffer the same fate? I suspect you, judging by the answer you've just given now, you're very confident. Well,
yes, we are fairly confident because we've actually gone to the inspectorate from the word go, and we've asked them what they're looking for. And hopefully that doesn't mean anything. Of course, we could have an inspector who changes everything, but as far as we're aware, that we're following their rules to the letter, and we're getting to a situation where I fancy we have a chance of getting through. I can't say better than that because you never know what's happening. I mean, the government changes, as was mentioned a moment ago, it changes its rules every 20 minutes. So. It could be something completely different come out by the time we put the inspector gets our local plan.
I found the easiest way to figure it out is to wait until a senior Conservative comes on TV and says something, and then you're guaranteed the opposite will happen. That's the easiest way I found.
Oh, I'm not going to draw you on that, Councillor, given your political affiliation, so we can't get into And let's hope that I had a really good gag there about Bono, and I still haven't found what I'm looking for in the inspector. But I feel like you know, I might miss the opportunity there on that one. So, Councillor Harwood, I will get you on duty to cooperate. How did you find the process, you know, with your neighbouring authorities?
It's tricky, you know. It's every borough has its own constraints, but that duty is there to ensure that arbitrary lines on a map aren't constraining planning in a way that is resulting in bad decision making. So it makes logical sense. So we have Mole Valley next to us, which has a very similar set of issues, and they've recently came to us with some unmet need, and it's, you know, we're in a very similar situation in that 90% green belt, they have AOMB and various other things. So if you can demonstrate that your constraints, you're just as constrained as your neighbour, then it's actually a fairly straightforward process. I don't think we're particularly concerned about it at this stage. If you have a neighbour that is more constrained than yourself, and they can demonstrate that simply you are more viable, then you're out of luck, and you're almost compelled by the inspector to take that number on. So we are all victims of circumstance, and I appreciate that, you know, we all operate in our own little kingdoms and sometimes, but those are just lines on a map. And when the national government wants to build, I'm not sure they pay a huge amount of attention to those lines.
So you must spend a lot of your time buttering up your neighbouring authorities, saying, "Please,
yeah,
stay
I've got
away.
a stamp that
Please
just says
stay
no."
Please stay away. Just stay away. Thank you. And Rebekah, I'll draw you in more generally on duty to cooperate, because, you know, we've seen in Kent particularly, there's been, you know, lots of problems with local authorities on this issue. Is this something that you see across, you know, the areas where you're working, that sort of local plans fall down on this type of issue, or is this uniquely Kent related?
I'm afraid it is all too common, and I think that the government was very clear about what was expected, and very early on, a few, you know, local plans failed as a result of not having achieved what was expected, and yet it's still happening. I can recall I was specifically involved in the Chiltern local plan, and the inspector there was very clear that it was necessary. You couldn't just sit there and say, we're a greenbelt authority, we can't do anything about it, sorry. You've got to really look for options. And the issue that was the case with Buckinghamshire was that you had South Bucks and Chiltern and Wickham all saying we can't fit everything in. Aylesbury saying, well, we can't just keep taking everybody else's numbers. And fundamentally, if you do that, if you load all of the numbers into one area, the demand that was in the other districts doesn't disappear. It isn't actually delivered by putting the numbers somewhere else, because there was a reason why that need was in that particular area. I guess for Buckinghamshire it's different now. They're one authority, they can probably get away with it a bit more easily. But certainly we've seen it across the country, and it's very frustrating when what's actually required should be relatively simple. You've just got to talk to your neighbours, record what you've said, and explain why that means what it means to you and what decision you've made. It doesn't mean that you have to do something that you really don't want to do. You just need to show that you've tried and you can justify why you've done what you've done. And it's that simple process of just burying your head in the sand that puts people at risk and can be avoided by proper communication and recording and justification.
It seems like a very odd thing for these things to fall down on, you know, people just not talking to each other. Let's all just get round the table, eh? Darren Page, I've got a couple of questions from, and I'm gonna make a final call for questions, because I'm going to draw things to a conclusion in the next 10 minutes or so. So, Councillor Harwood, how are the council going in terms of meeting housing needs in the short to medium term? A number of housing sites outside of the town centre were put to one side before the local plan was finalised, and as Rebekah said, was probably out of date as soon as adopted. Will these and others be revisited sooner rather than later? Can the town centre offer future meaningful housing? There's probably a development locally that's already started to propose this, but I might draw you on that in a bit. But
yeah, I think it will all depend on the timing and the logistics of our larger housing delivery. If we feel that we're falling behind, then we don't have a choice. We'll absolutely be considering. But at the same time, many will notice, if looking closely, that the council has been gearing now to handle some of its own house building. So we have a number of projects that we're on the cusp of pushing forward from our own housing stock, and with a heavy emphasis on either affordability or particular need that we want to meet in terms of sizing. So the council is absolutely on top of this in that regard, and we admit that there are certain elements that may have come forward, especially now that some of our villages have been inset and some areas have been no longer offer the green belt protection. It would be dishonest to pretend that those aren't enticing to prop up the housing delivery number. So yes, the short answer is yes, but it's a bit more complicated than that. I think that given the amount of pushback we've received over the last couple of years with regards to development, we will be very cautious in trying to bite off more than we can chew. So we'll be playing a fine game of trying to keep up.
And Councillor McDermott, I'll bring you in as well. Obviously, if sites have not been allocated or they're not being considered currently as part of the local plan, are these sites in the near future that you would revisit potentially if the plan is considered out of date as soon as it's adopted? How are you going to treat those sites that haven't been allocated in the local plan? I think you're on mute. The famous "you're on mute."
I'm muted. Yes.
There we go.
One of the things from coming out of government is the fact we've now got to immediately go for another 5-year plan. So we've got to prepare something in 5 years for the update. So we are working on that now. And in fact, part of the housing supply that we've actually got on our proposed local plan is going to go in over the term, so it will go to the next term as well. But on top of that, we've got sites which we've turned down for one reason or another, and maybe they might come back into it.
Yeah.
But we are working now, and I'm sure everywhere in the country's got to do it. We're working for to get an update in 5 years. Otherwise, we'll be in trouble with the government.
Indeed. Okay, I'm going to take the next question. I think I'm going to make this the last question as well. So this is actually directed to Rebekah, but I think I'm going to apply it across the panel. But so this is again from Darren. I find the use of beautiful in the second pillar of the white paper interesting. Putting together meaningful, non-specific design codes seems problematic. I fear this will constrict design rather than truly support innovative design. Over the pond, Trump he gets a mention. Over the pond, Trump introduced a policy that all government buildings should be beautiful. However, had a very strict view of beauty, i.e. only American classicism and lots of, I'm adding this, Darren, you didn't say this, and lots of gold, apparently, lots and lots of gold. So Rebekah, what's your opinion on this whole building beautiful pillar? What does it actually mean? And what, in reality, what are our local authorities going to have to do to deliver on it without restricting innovation?
And allowing architects like Darren to do their job.
There we go.
It does worry me. Design codes aren't new. They have been around for a long time, but they are very limited in their application, in my experience. I can recall them being used specifically on a particular allocation in an area where it was a whole new housing estate, and the design code was tailored specifically for that development. So it wasn't trying to cover the whole district, it was just focused on one development and what they wanted to see achieved there. And it came down to details like how wide should the roads be, what materials should be used, how big should the front gardens be, what boundary treatment should there be, all of that sort of stuff. And when you're doing it on that finite scale and you're developing it as part of a master plan for an area in consultation with the architect, then that's one thing. But if you're trying to apply it to a whole district and come up with some kind of rules that work across villages, towns, cities, countryside, all sorts of different characters of area, I just can't see how it can work. Therefore, you're back to trying to do it on a much finer grain, but still covering the whole area. And the work involved in that and trying to get something that's actually tangibly useful seems like an impossible ask, to the extent that you then have to question why are we even trying? Because if it just seems like it's never going to work, then maybe it's the wrong thing to do. So it does worry me. I don't know whether somebody in the government has got this idea of how it's going to work, but there's got to be room for pushing the boundaries of design and not just replicating what's there. Even if what's there is great, doesn't mean that replicating it is the right thing. And if it's rubbish, then replicating it definitely isn't the right thing. So you've got to give room for architects to be able to push the limits of what they do, for people to, you know, design things in a way that is what they want to have as their legacy. And so it does jar with me, and I do wonder whether it is something that is just going to get dropped along the way, because actually there's bigger priorities. I don't disagree that we should be planning for beautiful places, but it is subjective, and you're always going to have things that some people love and some people hate. Yeah. So yeah, that's where I'm at with it. So it'll be interesting to see how it does materialize, if it does.
We just need to make architecture great again, right?
Absolutely.
So Councillor McDermott, I'll chuck that one over to you. What does a model design code look like to you locally? But also, here's a question for you. Is there a building or a development that you've seen in your neck of the woods in the last, let's say, 2 decades that you would consider to be beautiful?
Yes, and there's some that I think are disgusting. But, that's the whole point about planning. It's very emotive. I mean, 4 of us are here now. We could have one building and we might get 4 completely different answers about what it's like. I mean, the town hall and the assembly hall, which is the theatre, are listed. Parts of them are listed. They were built finished in 1937. Half the population hates them, and half the population thinks they're fantastic. I mean, it's like anything you get. And I really do think that some new designs are very, very good. I do like them a lot. I just happen to be one of these kind of people that likes to see chimneys. But I mean, these days no one builds a chimney because you can't have open fires anymore. But I mean, yes, it is so very emotive, and it really is. Sometimes people get really passionate about these things. But I think modern designs are very good. Some of them.
So we're going to break the news tonight. Your area of the world, model design code, put chimneys in. Put chimneys in. There we go. There we go. Well, that's a key takeaway from tonight. Councillor Harwood, I'll throw it lastly over to you. What does it look like? And have you got a beautiful building to name? In Guildford.
There are a fair few, yeah. I mean, but okay, I'm gonna say something a little controversial, because why not? It's a good ending point. My interest in the aesthetics is inversely proportional to the other objectives you've achieved. If you give me a truly sustainable building that meets all my biodiversity requirements in its carbon emissions and everything else, you can have it purple with polka dots for all I care. And I would love to see an emphasis shift towards a more functional and long-term sustainability as opposed to a purely aesthetics, precisely for the reasons we've named, which is that, I mean, I quite like neoliberal, new wave and all that sort of fairly clean line design. And a great example, my wife absolutely hates it. She wants classic traditional Victorian. And okay, that's not a good example actually, because when we decided that, she just won that argument. But nonetheless, there are people that can decide between these things, and that's all very well. But architecture grows, new styles come and go, and we evolve in our tastes. So for me, the emphasis needs to be away from words like beautiful or pretty or anything else that's subjective, and I want to see a much more shift towards objective assessment of design.
Very good.
Understood. Well, I'm going to call proceedings to a conclusion, because looking outside, there's still a bit of light left. So let's go out and, I would say, top up the vitamin D, but the sun has gone. Just to say thank you to Councillor Harwood, Councillor McDermott, Rebekah for attending this evening. Really enjoyed the discussion. Councillor McDermott, best of luck with the local plan process.
Thank you.
And, yeah, and you'll be out again in about a year's time with a fresh one.
Yeah, we're trying to get a new one. Yeah.
Indeed. So just to say that we, subject to the permission of the speakers, we will be placing a recording online, and just to say thank you very much to everybody that's attended, and we'll be having a few more webinars. Hopefully at some point we'll be able to have a physical event, which would be tremendous. But until then, Have a wonderful evening, and toodaloo.
Thank you, Oliver.